Well, good afternoon and welcome everyone to what I hope is going to be an hour of really interesting conversation about development partnerships. I'm joined here in the studio by Martin Taylor, who is the co-founder of Contact Guru, and online we can see David Archer, who's the chief executive of Huck, and what Huck is, of more of that later. But we're here talking about development partnerships today. There's always a conversation between providers and the NHS about partnership, but I do sense that in this particular case, you've kind of somehow managed to capture the essence of partnership, and you have worked very closely with the NHS. Let's start with how have you sort of approached this whole business of partnership?
Yeah, well, for us, partnerships have always been really at the core of what we do. So as a technology company, where 3/4 of our headcount are engineers of one kind or another, inevitably we're going to need partnerships to get out into the wider world. And I think in healthcare, partnerships are absolutely even more important, because the way we're applying our technology is necessarily somewhat alien to the coders in the building. So we need people like Huck, like David, to really translate our technology into usable healthcare solutions.
David, what for you is the essence of partnership? How would you describe it?
I think it goes back to our roots as an organisation and our constitution as a social enterprise and not-for-profit ethos, that we're here to facilitate integration, partnership, and are constituted to do that. So we definitely can't do everything ourselves, but that sort of partnership approach of how we can be the glue to hold clinical services and operational services together and fuse that technology as an extra layer of glue has been sort of core to our foundations since 2007 when we were formed.
Yes, I can understand. And Martin, I think the essence of partnership is being frank about the relationship, what you can bring to the relationship, what you can deliver and what you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've always been clear we can't do everything, and we are better at certain things than others. And I think working with David, he's understood where our core strength areas are, and also he's had a feel for things that he's not doing yet, but that our technology could potentially be useful for. And I think that's why we've had such a series of successful development partnerships with David over very many years now.
This sounds to me, David, like it should be called developmental partnerships.
Yeah, we've almost sort of created just the way the two organisations have come together, and we've sort of got a melting pot of ideas whereby we've got challenges from an operational or a clinical perspective, and we'll be able to throw that in the melting pot. And then Martin and his team have been able to come up with suggestions, but then we've also been able to advise from our coalface perspective, if you like, about how those ideas could be taken forward, the clinical safety of them, the deployment options, etc., so that they can be used on a larger market and different markets.
How do you sort of evolve over the issue of language? Because this sector does have a peculiar set of language, doesn't it? It has its own unique governance issues. I mean, it is a very complex sector.
Oh, it is. In fact, all of the sectors in which we operate each have their own vocabulary, their own unexplained acronyms sometimes.
Yes.
But obviously in health, you've also got the moving landscape. So the organisations, the structures are ever changing. And so we've needed not only the pure clinical side of things to be kind of explained to us, but also we've needed to keep track of the tectonic plate changes as well. And on the clinical side, we've gone on to have some of our own clinicians in-house, because nowadays you have to have a clinical safety case for pretty much anything that moves. So having a clinical safety officer who can also kind of guide us on some of the things we should be looking at or should be avoiding. And I think that has probably helped further in working with David and his team to really create that nice mesh between the two organisations.
Yeah, David, I sense that's really important. I mean, this sector really hasn't really distinguished itself, has it, in its relationship with IT and information technology, the management of information by the use of technology. It's been a kind of tough interface, but somehow or other you've managed to get around that.
Yeah, I think we have, and I think it's goes back to the sort of shared vision and values of what we're trying to achieve. I think one of the interesting things.
Yes, I'm sorry. I'm just going to interrupt you there, because I think that's really important. It's the shared values, isn't it? And a lot of this sort of value stuff that's talked about is quite ephemeral and doesn't mean very much. But actually, it's really very important here. Did you sit down together and decide what the values were? How did you? I'm interested in the nuts and bolts of that. How that worked.
I don't think we did. I think it just grew from conversations,
really?
And sort of shared ideas. The patient is at the centre of everything that we're trying to do, and the safety of that, how we can use technology to improve things. I was just going to say that one of the things that probably as a third-party observer in some of those discussions, it would look like it would be difficult to identify who was from Content Guru and who was from Hook, that the two parties are working together and contributing towards the solution. As Martin said about the clinical safety case, that there was Hook clinicians, Content Guru clinicians also contributing and really generating thoughts, challenge, ideas, etc. So I think it was organic that it grew just from a sort of a meeting of like minds, really.
Yeah, that's a huge compliment, isn't it?
Yeah.
When David says, no one knew who was who from which organisation.
Yeah, exactly. It was a meeting of minds. And in our cultural values, we have something called PSP, everyone's always told about as a new grad: problem, solution, product. So as a tech company, you shouldn't be leading with, this is our great tech, why don't you buy it?
No, that's always the case, isn't it? With technology, we say we've got this great app, we've got this great piece of software, we can do this. And we all sit there and think, what's it going to do? Exactly.
Well, it's actually with David, straight away when we started working together, it was on, I think, one of the phase 2 pilots, actually 2 of them, way back in 2014. And we had a mental health pilot and one using 111 operators for in-hours primary care, call handling. And actually was working together around the table to get these things done in a very short time. In fact, the mental health one was the very first of the 30-odd phase 2 pilots nationally to get delivered live.
Right.
And it's actually that speed of movement and just mingling around a table, not either side of it, but really together.
Yes.
That set it apart.
And you didn't come at this from a standing start, because you've got some very distinguished antecedents and clients already. We'll talk about that in a moment. But David, when you started this, what was the problem you wanted to solve? What was the idea? What was the ambition?
I think we saw the future of where technology could go, almost a necessity to provide sustainable services given workforce challenges, increasing demand, etc. And also some frustrations that we've sort of alluded to with off-the-shelf offerings, that we were very clear that we want the software not drive the service, or the solution not to drive the service, that the operational, the clinical best practice, that the software and the systems should support that best practice. So we've seen lots of examples whereby this is the off-the-shelf solution, and you've almost had to re-engineer how you'd work clinically and operationally, and we were really resistant to that. And I think that was probably one of the key factors of where the relationship became really successful, because Martin's team came at it with that approach that, we're not going to force this onto you because it's already developed and it's already a commercial offering. It was actually that acceptance that it might be okay for a different industry, but from a health perspective, it's got different requirements, it's got different safety valves, it's got different governance elements, and there was a real engagement to take that on board and really work with us on that. And that's sort of, I guess, one of the big foundations of where the relationship's grown from, that there's been that real commitment to develop bespoke industry specific things that come from a platform of a wider industry, and now we've sort of grown together to adapt them, but making them fit for purpose rather than sort of take it or leave it, as we've seen with some other
Yeah, I think
vendors.
that's really interesting that you went for bespoke rather than off the shelf. Well, okay, so Marty, just give us the top line. What does this do?
Yeah. Well, we're essentially about providing HUC's contact center infrastructure, and it's contact center is a slightly trammeled term, but the contact between the service user and HUC and the urgent care environment in the area, and they live within HUC's East of England patch. So it's about managing those communications effectively, and we're doing it from our cloud. So we have this big cloud called Storm, and we have a big practice of contact center as a service, so cloud contact center. We do it for hundreds of large organizations, bits of government and so on. And we've repurposed that specifically for healthcare requirements in the urgent and emergency care space.
Right. So but there are a lot of people connecting into that, isn't it? I mean, yes. Unlike a business that might want to connect with its customers, there's one customer, one business, one service, and that's relatively straightforward. But because with the health and care sector, you've got one patient, but you've got multiple services that connect into that.
Absolutely.
And David, I'm sure you agree, interoperability has always been the holy grail that's always talked about. And in 40 years of watching the NHS, I've never seen anybody really achieve it. I mean, that must have been uppermost in your mind.
Yeah, I mean, interoperability and automation is key. We know that people are expensive, and certainly in clinicians, there's few and far between. So how we can move information around, how we can automate things has been really key. And I think that's one of the value adds that we've achieved with Content Guru, that it's not just been the automation around the Storm platform. It's how it links in with other products and how we share information and really fuse the infrastructure to be an asset to the health economy.
That's a really good phrase, David. Fusing the infrastructure. I mean, Martin, is it possible in plain English to explain how you did that and how you got everybody being able to talk to everybody else?
Yeah, well, systems are all slightly different, but they all have ways in which they can communicate. And we're lucky in that as a technology company, we've got a lot of different tools, so we can talk to read and write from different information systems simultaneously in different ways. So it may be that we've got a caller coming in, for example, and we're finding out who they are within an automated environment, perhaps using natural language processing in something, again, we've pioneered with HUC. We're opening a new case in Adastra, and then we're going to just put that case in front of the health advisor on a new screen. And then something we're working on now is to pop open that record, so you're not having to open it up, and you're thus saving a lot of time and keying errors. And again, maybe at the end of the call, where the Adastra system produces a post-event message, let's receive that message. Let's take out the parts of it that are relevant to the patient for their self-care advice and so on. Let's package that up, send that service user a text message. They can click through a link, which will take them to effectively a personalized mini web page of that health advice that the HUC health advisor has given them, thus saving, eventually, I hope, the health advisor from having to read out the health advice, so time saving. And for the service user, who might well be feeling ill, they might not remember all that was said, they've got a concise record of where they're meant to go, what the advice is, what the problem is, that they can refer to later, and might avoid them actually needing to call HUC back again and ask the same question. So if you've got access to those records and you can extract useful information from them, then repurpose that for whether it's a health advisor, a clinician, or a service user, a patient's parent. That's our role, to kind of sit in the middle and do all of that.
Did you get any pushback from the proprietary products that you were connecting with?
Some are keener than others, certainly. But I think the important thing is, as David's model has now transitioned into being NHS England's single virtual contact centre. That's a pretty successful partnership. What we've done together has become the national template now. Then I think all of those, particularly workflow providers, have been very keen now to engage with us.
I guess that's the direction of travel. They've got to, but that you must be very pleased with that, David. That you've gone from sort of fairly, not to be discourteous, but humble beginnings, if I can put it like that, now to a national footprint.
Yeah, I mean, it's a credit to everybody within Content Guru and my own colleagues in Hook, as well as our sort of commissioners and other partners, of how that's relationships have developed and how we've moved forward. One of the key elements that we really want to move forward with, Martin's touched on natural language processing, but one of the criticisms we've seen with 111 is it's too generic, and that it's sort of one size fits all. And we've been using telephony data and patient data, fuse them together through interoperability and some clever coding that allows us to identify a patient from their telephone number and to start to generate that move into a specific part of the service, so that you build on that bespoke idea that we move, rather than go through all the duplication of particular questions that the generic NHS 111 provides. Then we start to code it based on and route people based on their primary diagnosis. So palliative care patients.
Yeah, I mean, that's really important, David, isn't it? Because one of the big criticisms of 111 was it was plodding through an algorithm, asking a whole load of questions that weren't really relevant. It was irritating for the patient who was looking for help. But by connecting up front with the patient, does that avoid a lot of that?
Yeah, absolutely. The more we know about them before we treat them, the further we can personalise the journey. So within our wider contact centre practice, we always talk about mass personalisation. So the ability to deal
That's
with...
a great phrase, isn't it? I must just say, mass personalisation. You heard it here first. That's a phrase really worth stealing, isn't it?
Yeah, so the kind of individual treatment, but on a population-wide scale. Yes. I think that's what a kind of cloud infrastructure gives you. And everyone wants to be treated on a personal basis.
Of course, yeah.
Without it getting creepy. And I think in the health environment, dealing with an NHS-type organisation, people do trust their information is going to be handled responsibly. And they actually imagine that the NHS probably knows all this about them anyway.
Yeah.
So the faster we can get them to where they need to be, the more appropriate the questions we're asking them, and the fewer inappropriate questions we're bothering them with,
yes,
the happier everybody is.
And what about, Dave, what about governance issues? I mean, this is always the big thing, isn't it? How do you audit this? How do you do the governance?
So I think that's one of the advantages that Martin alluded to of clinicians being within the Content Guru team, as well as within the sort of provider network, is that there's that understanding of how important the governance side of things is, and that we jointly work through that through clinical safety cases, privacy, impact assessments, all those sorts of things, so that the product and the solution that in effect we pilot has got buy-in from all parties, and that everybody's satisfied with the governance. It's all documented, and how we're going to audit, how we're going to review cases, how we're going to measure success. It's all agreed up front, but because there's clinicians' involvement from the tech side as well as the delivery side, then we're speaking the same language, so it makes things a lot easier than it would be if it was purely techies talking code to clinicians. It's that definitely won't work. So again, that's another real benefit of how the relationship.
That's learned a lesson really from NHS Direct, isn't it? In the early days, it was clinician driven, and then of course it was broken up into NHS 111. Costs drove down the clinical interface because of costs. Now it looks like you're recovering now.
Yeah, definitely. You're never going to have enough clinicians, so we want to use them sparingly and wisely. But obviously we want to use clinical knowledge and information well. And again, it comes back to that kind of fusion of what the technology makes possible and what is clinically not just safe, but desirable as an outcome. And actually, we've had many a session just behind us there with NHS colleagues, with HUC colleagues, really ideating in the customer experience centre, coming up with kind of concepts, seeing maybe things we're doing in other industries, and really coming up with some great ideas.
Yeah, I must say, I've had a look here this morning. It's like stepping into the future, isn't it? It's a bit like the Matrix or something.
Yeah.
It's not a backdrop.
No, it's a real. I know it looks, but look, honestly, it's real. Okay, so this has been a huge success. The start. So where are we going now with this? You're rolling this out.
Yeah, well, obviously it's a continuum. It started with these phase 2 pilots. The next
where
stage,
where were the phase 2 pilots?
Hertfordshire, actually. So one was working mental health with Hpft.
Yes. Now, mental health is very tricky. I'm sure you'll agree, David. I mean, it's nuanced, it's subtle. Patients often have difficulty communicating, don't want to communicate often. That presents a lot of challenges.
It does. But 111 is a great front door, because many people don't know the number of the local NHS crisis line. They all know 111. So it's about taking people to that appropriate treatment once you've identified that that's the sort of call they want to have. It's not about that they stub their toe or something. Let's take them away from the health advisor route and onto a specialist crisis call handler. So that was one of them. The other was around using the resources of the 111 service in hours. Because obviously you've got these contact centres and they work primarily at night, at the weekend, at Easter and so on. In the day, they're relatively peaceful, whereas the GP practices are kind of under fire at 8 in the morning. And so initially it was about that kind of under stress hour, 8 till 9, using HUC call handlers to supplement the primary care. And I view primary care as a 24-hour service, really. And it's the GP practices are hugely important, and they're at the centre of it. But they're only really there for about a third of the time. The rest of the space is the out of hours, so-called. It's the rest of the hours.
Yes.
So it's about kind of bringing that standard up. And then the next stage was providing the contact centre, initially in Hertfordshire, Cambridgeshire and Peterborough. Then we added Luton and Bedfordshire, West Essex, till they've got this kind of 3.5 million odd footprint. The next stage beyond there was things like we've heard on the automation side, the NLP, work we've been doing
Just
on
say
audit.
NLP
Sorry,
in language.
natural language processing.
Thank you.
We're always guilty of unexplained acronyms in tech, almost as bad as you healthcare people. And then audit.
You put you two together and no one will ever understand anything anybody ever said.
Yeah, at least for us.
Yes.
Stuff we've imported from our London Patient Relationship Manager, PRM program, and again, hugely successful partnership with Healthy London Partners. And then things we innovated during the pandemic. So,
well, I want to come on to the pandemic in a moment, if I may. If I may just break in and say, look, this is very interesting. Let's have a look. We've got about another half an hour left. If you've got a question, then just drop it in the Q&A or in the chat box, and it'll appear on my screen here, and I can ask the question for you. So don't end the session and think, oh gosh, I wish I'd asked that. So let's have your questions. If you've got any. Before we get on to the pandemic, because I think there's some interesting stories there, I wanted to give people a flavour of who your other customers and clients were. It's a real mixed bag of very interesting people, including, I think you've done TV voting, which I don't know how that works, because everybody reaches for their phone at the same time. They all ring in within the same 30 seconds. How do you manage that?
Well, that was kind of the start of our journey before we ever kind of came into view of health, was TV voting. So when Anton Deck put the number on the screen, if you came back into the noughties, everyone dialed that number, would be dealing with hundreds of thousands of calls within seconds.
Well, I watched the programme the other night. They're doing this thing, is this your house? And they give you 15 seconds to say, yes, I'm living in the street and that's my house. You must get bottomed out.
Exactly. It was a great training ground. We worked on Big Brother when that first launched, X Factor, Pop Idol, all of those big shows.
And that was for you to learn, really, about handling capacity.
What's it like to be on the end of a tidal wave?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So if you can not be knocked over by that tidal wave and not take the network down with you, you're probably pretty robust. And so that really gave us the credentials to think we could do this, but the same scale, but multi-tenanted, so that people like Huck could use it, not just people like BT, and then that we would make complex services available at that same scale. And if you think of what we're doing with Huck, these health services, they are really complex services, complex queuing. We're not just dealing with phone calls now, but it's other digital channels as well. It's things like video. So all of the complexity plus the scale. And so when we're dealing with, let's say something trivial like a vote, maybe you're only allowed to vote 3 times. At the 4th vote, we still have to recognize it's you to tell you you can't vote the 4th time, and that you won't be charged because we're using a network message to tell you that. We were the only people that could reliably sift out that 4th caller, as well as taking in entries on web and by SMS.
Perhaps you could use the 4th call to give people health advice.
Yeah, funnily enough.
Public health messages.
In
Pakistan, will love it. Yeah.
In Pakistan, I went to a talk at HIMSS in the States a few weeks ago. There was a guy from the Pakistan Health Ministry, and they got all of the phone companies to change their ringtones to health advice. So instead of ring ring, you would hear COVID advice, because a lot of people thought COVID was just a hoax in the early days there, and so they used the first 3 seconds to get the big messages in, and then kind of longer.
How interesting. Yeah. So instead of listening to music, they can listen to health messages. I've got a question. Allah has given us a question. Let me ask you this: can patients check their data? Is there additional security for recognition via phone number, e.g. parent checking on son or daughter? That's a really good question, and thank you for it. David, can you answer that?
Yeah, so in terms of the checking process, there's an established validation process to make sure that we're talking to the right person, and obviously we don't disclose anything. It's a series of questions that we ask, and say is well established from that perspective. And as the initial data, that is something that's sort of agreed as part of a commissioner and a wider information sharing agreement as to what information is shared, how it's shared, what format, where it goes, and then all the owners of that data, if you like, are signed up to that agreement. It's all documented. So that's one of the biggest hurdles to get.
It's pretty basic. It's very important, but quite difficult to do, isn't it? Because it would be very easy for a parent to impersonate a child, for example, or a teenager.
Absolutely, yeah. So we use the information that we've already got, the information that comes from various feeds, and then there's an established governance process that's into the way that they operate as 111 operators to make sure that they are confirming it's the right person.
Good. And John Adamson has given us a question. John, thank you very much for your question. If you have a question, now's the time to put it in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll get them answered if we can. So John is asking, what functionality is being provided to help GPs manage their patients more effectively? Now, I mean, Martin, you were talking about the GP interface and that golden hour in the morning where nobody can get a GP appointment. What can you do for that? Or what are you doing for that?
Yeah, I mean, most of our work in primary care is around the out-of-hours space. I mean, we've got some primary care in-hours customers. It's not really been our focus because the kind of scale of urgent and emergency care has been, in the early stages, more suited to cloud. But certainly with GPs, again, you've got the same challenges. You've got information systems, you've got TPP System 1, EMIS, and you've got Vision. There's microtest as well. So all of those can talk. So if you are able to, for example, make an appointment booking or some sort of triage level can take place perhaps ahead of an appointment, and that's certainly all available for GPs as well.
So the decision could be made. You don't really need to see a GP. You need to see a physio or a pharmacist or an allied health professional.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's not just the case for GPs, but as David worked on, it's the case where you're going from urgent and emergency care to ED. So everywhere where there's this kind of transition, I think it is useful to be able to interrogate the service user and just check that they really are needing to go on to that next stage. They do need that appointment. That is the way that they will be best served.
Yeah, the flow is so important,
Yeah.
isn't it? Okay, well, look, we can't have a conversation about this sector and IT without the pandemic, and you mentioned it earlier. So, David, what happened during the pandemic for you?
Yeah, lots of things. Most of them very, very challenging, but I guess we've been fortuitous in our relationship with Martin and Content Guru, that we had a few tools available to help us with the challenges. So the first one really was about the contact centres are great in normal times, but they're not really successful when you've got an airborne virus and you've got lots of people in the same room. So one of the things that we were quickly able to do from a one-on-one perspective, and also the sort of wider medical input from GPs on a 24/7 basis, is because of the ease of deployment and the cloud-based delivery of the telephony platform, we were able to deploy that so that colleagues could work from home in a secure environment. We could deploy it so that GPs who were working during the day in general practice were able to dial in and support and triage patients with those initial sort of phase one challenges, and they had the same protection, if you like, from call recording as if they were in a contact centre. So in effect, we were able to, rather than having 4 contact centres, we were sort of able to spread it out into about 50 and really quickly, because there was no third-party apps needed in order to be installed. It was basically a web deployment, so really fast and flexible. So that really helped with maintaining access, maintaining clinical safety, speed of response. And because it's all within the same platform, and there was obviously restrictions that were pretty hastily put in place about physically seeing patients, then we were able to deploy the Storm video consultation module. So again, really easy to deploy from our perspective, because it sat in the same application that clinicians use, but it also didn't require an app to be previously downloaded onto the user's smartphone or their iPad or anything. So in effect, the clinician decided they needed to see that patient, and they were able to just send a URL, one-time use, and any smartphone with a camera, they were able to connect to that securely.
Okay, right. I mean, that's a big change, isn't it? So
yeah, massive.
Technically, Martin, you're suddenly, as David said, you got 30 people working from home. What did that mean for you?
Yeah, it didn't matter too much to us, because we're in our cloud. So unlike a normal contact center where you'd have your own server room and that's where the physical machines would sit, ours sit across multiple UK data centers, and we don't really mind where everybody is. So in David's
does
case,
that need a secure line, or can you do it on a BT line, or do you do it on a web? How does it work?
Obviously, where you have a full-on contact center, of which David has some, then you can have a proper secure bandwidth going into those locations, and others are looking at using HSCN and so on. But actually, it can be carried over the internet with a good degree of security.
And that can be done on a laptop?
Yeah, absolutely. So that was generally what people were doing. Laptop, USB headset, and off you go, even for doing video. And if you think of a video, that is itself end-to-end encrypted.
Yes.
So one end is the patient or service user's mobile device. The other end, the laptop screen of the clinician.
Okay, so let's just unpack some of this, David, because you're both used to it. So during COVID, it meant that if I phoned into the call center, I'd get someone who was working from home somewhere or other. And if I needed a video consultation, they would send me a link, and then I would be connected.
Yeah, if you get an SMS, it's got a single-use link on it, so you can only press it once.
Yeah.
You can't come back to it next day or anything. That will establish 2 things. One, a connection to the screen and camera if it's two-way on the clinician end. The other, it asks permission to turn on your camera and screen on your mobile device. So you click yes, and then off you go. That's it. It's literally established there and then. No booking, no app.
I mean, that's a big step forward, David. I mean, do you see that continuing on going into the future?
Yeah, I think it has continued. So when we first deployed it, it was basically telephone or video, or for those who were very clinically unwell, a home visit, and obviously that's moved. That same position was put in place in hours with general practice, and we've seen some move away from that because it's clearly not suitable to see everybody over a video link. But I think it's here to stay, and therefore, improves the efficiency of services, the use of clinical time, and patient experience, because the need for coming into primary care centres to be physically seen is moving away. And then when you combine that with other technologies like the electronic prescribing service, so that the clinician can actually prescribe something to you following that video consultation that you can then pick up at your local community pharmacist, then it becomes a really powerful, slick operation.
It opens a whole new door, doesn't it? Just before I move on, I just want to pick up a couple of questions. Mark Kendall sent us a question. Mark, thank you for your question. If you've got a question, now's the time to do it. We've got time left. Mark is asking, what were the digital channel shifts you were able to leverage to benefit patients, and how did you measure this? I think, Martin, that sounds incomprehensible, and one for you.
So lots of talk always about channel shift, isn't there?
Yes.
And many people misinterpret that to mean we want to take people from having a phone call and kind of force them to go and self-serve using an online form somewhere. We don't really believe in forcing people to do anything. If you provide them with other more appropriate means of getting the outcome they want or the information they need, then that's worth a go. But as far back as about 2016, we worked with David on one of the early clinical decision support service self-triage pilots in Cambridge and Peterborough. And there, if you were calling in and you were waiting on hold and you're on a mobile, again, it's just like we would with the video, we send you an SMS, you click on the link while you're still in the queue, and then you can start to work through a self-triage menu on your screen. So the next question would come up, we'll decide how to present that. Is it a tick all that apply, a radio button, drop-down list, and so on? That leads then to the next question, and then hopefully you've either fully or partially completed that journey, and we can pass on the probable dispositions and the Q&A journey with the call on the screen as it arrives. So that's a good use of digital there. It's not requiring people to move off. They can if they want, but it's adding a bit more value. And I think we've got instant message chat. That's something you could easily apply. We've been talking with the NHS app people about why not have click speak from the app rather than actually breaking out of that online environment and dialing 111. Again, it could go to the same place. It could go to David's contact centres, but we would know which page that has come from, and indeed who it is if they've gone through NHS login. Social, obviously, not used much in health, but we've got all the social channels on the platform, from Twitter, Facebook, WhatsApp, TikTok we're doing at the moment with Instagram. So if people have applications that might need some of these visual or written mechanisms, even email, there's the ability to process those within the same environment.
It's really interesting. There you are, Mark. You asked a really interesting question. Alex, come back. Are you considering use of private 5G networks to address digital divide?
Frankie, 5G. So obviously we had 3G, we've got 4G.
It's 6G.
5G. Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
I remember when the replacement for the airwave Tetra system was proposed, and it was exciting. It was going to be 4G. 4G was in the future.
Yes.
And now already we can have 5G. These are just different transmission mechanisms. A lot of what goes on is actually people's own Wi-Fi in the home environment at the patient service user end. They've got some BT broadband. They probably outgunned it during the pandemic, like I did, so they could watch Netflix and binge box sets.
Yes.
So that means that you've actually got a pretty decent data environment in most homes now, whether that's a home with a health advisor living in it, or a clinician, or it's just a service user. So that's the primary mechanism. 4G, 5G, it improves the quality of, say, a video interaction. And I think if we're looking at maybe using the NHS app more and getting more value out of that, such as using it to do real-time communications into a 111 or UEC provider, then having that bandwidth there, because it's not a phone call, it's using the data bandwidth, or it's probably part of a bundle that you've got with your mobile device.
Well, it's interesting, if you look at the NHS recovery program, a large, I mean, they're going to struggle with that because they're still struggling with COVID, and how long, who knows how long it's going to take to overcome the waiting list problem. But a large part of that is seen to be managed by the NHS app, outpatient appointments and advice and pre-op advice and things like that. So, it's kind of on the agenda, isn't it? What is also on the agenda, David, are virtual wards. And it seems to me that this technology is right up that street.
Yeah, I mean, it absolutely is. And I think some of the examples that we've got, which we're really proud of with our work with, not just with Content Guru, but with Cambridge University Hospitals and the local CCG, is the virtual waiting room in Cambridge and Peterborough as an area where we have managed to expand the Storm platform and added some additional functionality. And we've now got a process whereby we've got secondary care ED consultants who are connected into the same platform, and they in effect perform a virtual ED consultation from with a clinician based in the hospital but a patient based at home, and they're managing to deal with about 80% of calls that traditionally 111, even after a GP input, would have sent to ED for further examination. Those consultants are able to deal with those without referring them into hospital or the need for an ambulance, so they're making a massive impact. And there are plans to now we've sort of proved the concept of that with a HSJ ward, which is really icing on the cake, but that's going to be rolled out even further across
yes, well, congratulations on that. I mean, virtual wards are a big opportunity for you, aren't they now? Because the delayed transfers of care are causing trusts a huge problem. Admissions are causing a problem for the ambulance service. The trick is keeping people out of hospital, but doing it safely. That's
absolutely.
That's the bit that worries me about this.
Yeah, obviously it worries everybody, and it's gone hand in hand with the ICS formations. Of course, you've got some new structures and something new that they've got to do. From our point of view, the virtual ward is an Internet of Things transaction. So just as with the power company, we're monitoring the smart meter outputs. So those are flowing into our system, and we're kind of making decisions about what to do with those for our power company customers. Similarly, there will be maybe somebody's been discharged into a virtual ward. Someone's gone round with a pack of stuff as a pulse ox, blood pressure meter, maybe some scales. Readings are coming in. We're identifying that those are within bounds for that particular patient, or they've gone out of bounds. And again, that's where the contact center comes in, the clinician making the decisions. And it might be a call goes out there, maybe they need to do a reading again. Okay, it's normal now, it was just a misreading. Or it could be that you need to dispatch somebody to actually go through the door. It could be a district nurse, some other sort of care provider. So I think there are quite a lot of systems need to come together to make an effective virtual ward, of which our technology bit is an important hub component, but it's only part of the mix. And we see virtual ward as the kind of one end of a continuum, which then goes to longer term remote patient monitoring. Because the virtual ward only lasts for 2 weeks. And then you've got RPM, and then the wider kind of community surveillance, where you're going into top tier local authority territory there, of looking after a large number of vulnerable or elderly, anyway, people living independently at home.
And connecting data between social care and healthcare. Again, that's defeated everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've all worked with local authorities. We've got some of the largest in the country as customers. We've got some 60 or so in total. So some of them within David's patch. We've already started thinking about how to join some of those dots, because
the whole ICS thing is about joining the dots.
It is.
The integrated care organisations, as they're called. These are the next big thing. It's wending its way through the Westminster Gasworks at the moment. Hopefully, we'll get the bill to become an act and they'll be implemented. I mean, they're sort of there now, really. They just need some changes to the law so they can govern their own cash. Really, that's all it's about. But they're in sort of place now. And it just seems to me, as an NHS watcher for years, this is the last best opportunity we're going to have at some sort of integration, getting everybody around the table or taking advantage of the fact that everyone's there. And at the hub of that, the heart of that, has to be an integration of IT and the management of patients by the use of technology.
I think we're kind of harnessing the wartime solidarity that we've gained during the COVID
pandemic.
Exactly. And we've never
had... people have seen, haven't they? You've probably seen this, David. People during the pandemic, I remember Matthew Gall from NHSX wrote his famous memo that said, don't worry about GDPR and data, just use it sensibly. And guess what? Everybody did. And that's a legacy. We're kind of COVID custodians, aren't we now? Respecting the past, but taking the best of it into the future.
Yeah, sort of a governance light approach where the key elements were obviously continued to be considered and rightly so, but there was that air of innovation, problem solving, etc. And I think what we've got with certainly our view and how we've worked with Martin's team is that we've got an infrastructure that the government's paid for, the NHS has paid for, and we should sort of sweat that asset to link in with as many components as possible and use that functionality to bring health and social care together, because a lot of the things that we get through 111 are not medical related, they are social care, and the more we can bring those components together, we can build on the bespoke care options of getting the person to the right components. So we don't need to reinvent lots of different single points of access. We can just use in effect 111 as the access point, and then it's the technology and the providers who are hung off that with the correct levels of governance to actually get the patient to the right point of care with the least amount of duplication. And if we can crack that, then we've got a chance, really.
It is interesting. And Alla's come back into the chat, and she's made it might be a him or a her, I'm not sure. Apologies if I got that wrong. But Alla said, interesting, this is very interesting. Liverpool have piloted these so people can have kit and free access to protected Wi-Fi, deals with people that can't pay for Wi-Fi.
Absolutely.
This is quite interesting, isn't it? I mean, I don't want to stray into the politics of this, but I do remember a general election where a certain politician said as part of his manifesto, we're going to give everybody free Wi-Fi. And we all said, you're crazy. It's not so crazy now.
Yeah, definitely. And actually, when I went over to the States to look at how they've been doing these hospital at home type scenarios, the best ones have typically delivered a hub that's got its own SIM in it. So it creates a Wi-Fi network that's totally separate from the one being used to play Fortnite upstairs. It's got provided with a signal, the connection you need then to the wider network. So you're kind of taking it away from a dependency on the individual's own IT environment.
Yeah, it's become almost a utility like gas and electricity, isn't it?
Really? You notice it when it doesn't work.
I sure do. And David, I mean, there is always the question, isn't it? Well, what about people who can't manage the technology? What about people, I mean, typically people say older people who can't do technology. I'm not sure that's true as an older person myself, but it's often said. I mean, what are your thoughts around the equity of access to these technologies?
I think we have to be mindful that it's not just a technology thing. We've also got barriers about whether English is a first language. We've got challenges with the deaf community accessing services. So I think there's never one size fits all solution that technology can fix everything. So we're going to always need to have a combination of solutions to make sure that we maintain equitable access regardless of the circumstances. But what we are seeing is that where traditionally we've had to have a lot of manual interventions and a lot of people involved to fix some of those things. With the sort of growth of artificial intelligence, natural language processing, as we've talked about, then there is room to automate and improve that patient experience, so that in some ways patients might not realise that quite a lot of the techie phobe bit is actually being dealt with, and they're not even aware of that.
Yes, I mean, English not being the first language is a big problem, and I've seen it in hospitals, the translations that's required. But of course, now there's simultaneous translation, isn't there? I've got an app that I took on holiday to Italy, and I just say it, and my iPhone orders a drink.
Yes, exactly. So we've of course been experimenting with those. So you could speak speech to text, renders it into text. Translation layer translates it in real time. Text to speech reads it out as speech again in a different language at the other end, and vice versa. So those are of course really interesting technologies, but also there are uses of chat, for example, instant messaging, where you're kind of taking out some of the moving parts and you're adjusting the translation layer, so that you can cut down on, in many cases, the need to go and get a specialist translator. And a lot of those same technologies you can apply for the D-deaf community as well. So technology is sometimes the answer. In other cases, as David asserted there, it's about identifying who someone is and how best to treat them. And in other cases still, it's about siphoning off the majority of people to these really highly automated routes and leaving more human resource to deal with the rest of them.
What's interesting is that this capacity issue that you cope with so easily, is that because you can expand the cloud for capacity and then shrink it when you're not using it? Is there that?
As a service user, like a HUC, the cloud is just there, it's the cloud. We know we have to provision lots of capacity and data centers, but we look after all of that. So we had many instances during the pandemic where people really needed to call on that capacity. When furlough was introduced, the DWP, where we run the universal credit lines on the same contact center platform, they suddenly went up to the maximum of 10,000 in a queue. And normally their queue would be 50 to 100. So massive increase in queue. And in NHS London, where the 111 service took the brunt of the early pandemic, we had a 500% increase in call volume, 1,400% increase in overall call durations at the start of the pandemic. So the cloud acts as that kind of soak away, really, the buffer. And you can also, once people are in that cloud, start to take some of them to more automated means. So it's clear not everyone's going to be able to talk to somebody. So we know most of them are calling about the same thing. So let's get information.
So you can screen them, layer them as you go. Fine, yeah. Sally Plummer's coming question. She said, "Apologies if I missed this. Had to dip off." That's very bad, Sally. You must watch us all the time. She says, "Does your tech platform interface with the patient shared care record?" Well, I think we all know the answer to that.
Yeah. Well, we've never not been able to interface where there's willing.
Yes.
So yeah, we've done hundreds of integrations, many of them around the 111 space, Coordinate My Care, a neuro response, a migraine book of patients know best. There are obviously many more we haven't done, but provided there is some kind of capability to talk and above all a willingness on all parties to do it, then we can certainly make that happen.
Does that approval business, I mean, does that present you with a problem, David?
It can be quite challenging. Obviously, there's a big concern about the security of patient data and appropriate use.
Yeah.
It's really just
working. And that's held back. That's held back a lot of developments, hasn't it? Really.
Yeah, it is a challenge for historical reasons, and but I guess what we've been able to do is present a sort of joint front to some of the skeptics that we need to convince about how we're going to do that, how we're going to assure them that things are safe. We do quite a lot of work with patient engagement, Health Watch for example, to assure them about how it's going to be used, to educate them so that they can then brief patient groups and try and take out any concerns or noise that might be generated from those things, so that in effect we hit the ground running with those sides of things. But patient data is getting better, but it is a challenge.
I think there's a greater public awareness of the value of the use of data now, and I think perhaps that's one of the good things that's come out of COVID, although there's been a lot of bad as well. I need to just to correct the record. Ala has come back and she tells me she is a she, so I'm sorry if I gave you a sex change operation. I apologise for that. We're coming up to the buffers of times. We've got 4 minutes left. I think we'll leave the last word with David. But Martin, how do you see the future?
Yeah, the future, as someone wants to
we're almost here, aren't we?
Yeah, the future is, the present is only the sort of nearest most part of the future, as well as being the uppermost layer of the past. Yeah. So we're building on.
It's worth saying that again.
It is. Yes. I just thought of that. We'll transcribe that into something more eloquent. But we're already living in the near future now. Yeah. We've got learning algorithms. We've got digital technologies of all sorts. We've got agile working methodologies, so we can do things quickly and safely through various sprints, rather than these big monolith projects that have always failed. And there's the general will and acceptance from the user base. In fact,
yes, I think public trust is a big issue. I'm sure you'll agree with this, David, that the public are coming to trust more of these interventions. You go through these things. If you want to speak to somebody about this, press 1, 2. I mean, that's very tedious, but we're kind of getting used to that now. They can be done much better than they are being doing. And as you say, we've got a whole load of patients that suddenly want to be seen all at once. If you can find a way of channeling them,
totally,
that they are content with. That's the problem. Right.
I see in the near future, you'll call 111, you'll say what it is you want, and we'll take you straight there. The technologies to do that exist today. We're proving off a lot of them in our work with Huck.
Yes.
And I think we'll soon be at the point where people think it's safe not just to automate the module 0, but actually to let's just take all these interactive voice responses off the front end, all these announcements, or at least just have a couple that are perhaps regional, and then let's take them where they need to go.
Yes. David, I've cut you short. You've got about 45 seconds.
Yeah, I mean, it's I guess second what Martin said. We've got the ICSs, which will hopefully be the conduit for moving this integration agenda forward. As I said earlier, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. The technology platforms are already there. I think the next big challenge is obviously there's some reviews into the GMS contracts and general practice urgent care,
yes,
which accounts for millions of consultations, far more than 111 does, and how we use that technology to in effect provide a 365 general practice access points. And I think there's loads of ideas that we can do.
I'm sure there is 8,000 GP practices, and they've all got more customers than they need. Well, listen, thank you for hosting us, and I hope you've enjoyed it. My name's Roy Lilly, and I hope to see you again soon. Thank you very much.